Welcome to Sababoosh, the podcast of Milk and Honey. I'm your host, Jake Gillis. Join me in learning about Israeli culture from its movers and shakers. Connect with the Israel you love, or soon will. Sababoosh is leveling up, and I want to offer you an opportunity to become a part of our growth. We've launched a crowdfunding campaign with two options. One comes with exclusive swag, and the other takes the form of a tax-deductible donation. We're currently at 30% of our goal, and the campaign will end in 3 weeks. A big thank you to everyone who has already contributed so far. There are episodes lined up for the rest of the season, thanks for your generosity, with episodes coming each week for the foreseeable future. I'd be really grateful for your support. Listening to the podcast is already something that I don't take for granted, and if you're able to contribute in this way, it would just be a cherry on top. I'll add the details in the episode description. And now a quick word from our sponsor for this episode. If you're speaking in meetings or on stage with investors, donors, your teams, customers, you name it, TK Speaking Training helps you nail it to build stronger trust, make more of your time, and communicate as the best, most effective version of yourself. Listeners get a complimentary consultation. Reach out to Tova at tk-speaking.com with Sababoosh in the subject line and tell her what you're working on to find a time. I actually did a session with Tova to work on leading workshops, and I came out of it feeling much more confident and competent, and her approach left me at ease. I really thought that the session was very well organized and everything was very thoughtful and intentional. Welcome back to Sababoosh, the podcast of Milk and Honey. Today we're diving into one of Israel's proudest and most fascinating exports, high-tech innovation. From the invention of the USB drive to cutting-edge cybersecurity and mobile apps used worldwide, Israel has earned its nickname, the Startup Nation. But how did this tiny country with limited natural resources and constant geopolitical tension become a global powerhouse of innovation? A big part of the answer lies in a unique mix of cultural, historical, and economic factors. Mandatory military service that fosters leadership and tech skills, a culture that encourages risk-taking and chutzpah, world-class universities, and government support for R&D. The result? Thousands of startups, record-breaking investments, and a major role in shaping the future of technology. To unpack all of this, I'm joined by Aaron Kalman, the Chief of Staff at Lightrix, one of Israel's most successful startups and now high-tech companies. Lightrix is the force behind hit creative apps like Facetune and VideoLeap, used by millions around the world. Aaron brings a front-row view of what it takes to thrive in Israel's tech scene, from the early hustle to scaling globally, and what the day-to-day looks like at a company pushing the boundaries of creativity and tech. Whether you're a tech nerd, curious about Israeli innovation, or just want to know what it's like behind the scenes at a top startup, you're in for a good one. Let's get into it. Aaron Kalman is the Chief of Staff at Lightrix, a Jerusalemite by birth and by choice. Aaron previously worked for the Ruderman Family Foundation as a senior advisor to Israeli ministers and as an emissary to Sydney, Australia. Aaron, thanks so much for coming on Sababoosh.
Thank you, Jake, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
So I thought we could get started with, you work now in the high-tech world, and Israel's known as the startup nation. High-tech is very front and center in Israeli culture. Israel, when people think Israel, that's one of the things that comes up. And you work for Lightrix, which is a unicorn, and meaning that it's quite successful. Could you share a bit about a secret sauce, if there is one? What's made it so successful?
So I think like most successful things in life, there are two components to the secret sauce, and it's not such a big secret. One is the hard work, 3 components: hard work, good people, and I'll add as a third a little bit of luck on the way. Those are probably the most important ingredients in a good success story. Lightrix itself started here in Jerusalem 12 years or so now. It started as a bootstrapped company, B2C, meaning business to consumer, which is a rarity among Israeli high-tech companies. Most do business-to-business, B2B things. And it started really with a few friends who were studying together at Hebrew University, and I'm not going to tell all their stories now, but they decided to try and take what they were doing at the computer science lab there and see if they could turn into something that other people could use and maybe make a bit of money off it. The CEOs Zev likes to say they imagined that maybe they'd make $100,000 or something and enough to give them some padding so they could pursue their dream of building something else that's big. But the story is a different story. The first app that was released by Lightrix was Facetune, which has become sort of a household name in a lot of places. And since then, a lot of things have happened. But I think the most interesting one in the past few years is the pivot to AI and generative AI and everything involved there. And that's also changed Lightrix a lot. I've been there for 4 years, and what we do today is very different to what we did when I joined the company. I think we can talk about a bit AI later if you'd like. And that's really in a nutshell. There's good people. We're hiring. If anyone's looking, feel free to ping me. But good people, hard work, and really trying to do things that bring creative tools, which is the field we're in, human creativity, visual creativity, making those tools ones that allow people to bridge the gap between what they have in their imagination and what they want to create, and bring that creation and imagination to life. That's really
And
what
it
we're
seems
trying
that it's not such a rare story that friends in university or maybe in the army are coming together, sharing an idea, and it evolves into something. So it's cool to hear that, this is no exception. You've been very close in all of this for the last 4 years. How have you seen it grow and develop, and a bit about your own role in its growth?
So it's a good question. My role is the chief of staff, so I report to CEO. I'm sort of straddling that management team. There's certain things I'm part of the team, for other things I'm not. It depends really on what's going around. And I think that it's, again, from my personal sort of viewpoint, it's very interesting to be part of the decision-making process. So part of that decision-making when we decide to expand the company, whether it's acquire a company. We acquired a company in Chicago about 3 years ago, and be part of those discussions and the due diligence, and decide before you even select the company, this is something we want to do in a field we want to go towards, and then carry it out and integrate that company into Lightrix post acquisition. Whether it's other decisions which are shutting down certain things which weren't working so well, and we've also done that throughout the years. But really just being there and watching things grow, and I said it before, it comes down to being able to work with amazing people, from the founders and the management down to everyone, designers and marketeers and product people and engineers and researchers. Everyone pulls their part. And I think I have a pretty unique vantage point because I get to be involved in a lot of the strategic discussions. I got to sit in on a lot of the things that are happening. And I also have the privilege of being able to hop around and join different teams and different meetings to see what's going on in the company, which not everyone can do. And watching that growth, and it's a headcount growth since I've joined. We've grown as far as employees in Israel and abroad. It's a growth in revenues. It's a growth in business strategy. It's venturing into new places. I think all of that's really interesting to be part of.
It's so cool to hear that you do get to experience different pieces and jump around in the teams and be a part of those decisions. I'm curious, not that you've worked at a similar organization outside of Israel, but do you get the sense of what goes on in the office that is Israeli? Or from your experience as an Israeli, like the culture of the office? Or
I think it's a hard question for me. I think it's a hard question for me to answer because most of my professional life has been in Israel, besides a couple of years in Sydney, Australia, which are a wonderful family experience we can talk about later if you'd like to. I think you feel the difference between the Israelis and the not Israelis, even within Lightrix, because we have employees in the UK and we have employees in the US. And when you talk to them or there's meeting, there's little nuances that you try to convey or get through. And there's banter that can only happen in English or can only happen in Hebrew. And in Israel and the world we're living, obviously current affairs are also part of that. And being an Israeli company in the past 2 years also means dealing with sometimes hundreds of employees, or almost 100 employees rather, where either them or their spouse are in reserve duty and serving, and myself included, I've done a couple hundred a day so far. What supporting those people, and we talked about business, but the HR and operations side of things, how you reach out to them, how you communicate with them. I remember when I was in Miluim post October 7th, my wife telling me that she was getting a weekly or every other week a call from my HR partner at Lightrix saying what she needed at home, what the kids needed, getting packages to the house. So those are things that are very Israeli on the people side of things. The business side, I think there's a bit of good Israeli chutzpah. And you mentioned that friends from university or the army starting things together isn't so rare in general, and definitely not in Israel. Just those stories, and also really believing in ourselves, right? Thinking that, yes, there are things that we can do because we want to do them and we plan on doing them, and we're going to go get them.
I'm wondering, with your role, you report to the CEO. Chief of staff is a high up, very senior position. Do you get a sense that there is that rigid hierarchy? Like, how are you interacting with those teams that you're jumping around to, or maybe even junior employees? How do you see it?
That's a good question. I think that there's not, at the end of the day, hierarchies exist in organizations, and you can't avoid them. You need a management hierarchy, you need decision-making hierarchy, you need budget ownership hierarchies, you need all of those things. But I don't think we try to have a hierarchy in the sense that we believe that people and good ideas come from every person. They're not limited to your role, your title, or where you are in that hierarchy. So when I look at Lightrix as an example, our CEO meets with every single new employee who joins the company. He sits down with every new employee. Usually it's more of a group setting. So about once a month, he'll have 10, 15, 20 people, depending on the new hires from the past month, sit down with them, share his vision, take questions, any questions that they have. And you can imagine someone who joined 2 days ago, the company might have questions which for an employee who's been there for 6 months or 2 years or 5 years don't seem like the question you ask the CEO, but it's absolutely fine, because why not ask a question, and why not surface an idea or table a thought if you have one? And at the same time, all the C-levels, including the CEO and everyone else on the management team, have open door times in their calendar where they encourage people to come and talk to them, not as part of a professional sync on a specific product roadmap or on a business decision, but just to come and talk and share your thoughts. And again, it could be about operations, it could be about business, it could be about people, but good ideas have nothing to do with the title you have. And in that sense, I don't know if it's Israeli or not, but we encourage that sort of interaction between everyone.
I'm wondering about, you worked in government for a while, and I'm curious that dynamic, what you've noticed between maybe government ministers probably don't have those open door potentially, or maybe they do, but that comparison between the two, what have you experienced?
I think this kind of conversation about the difference between government to private sector could be a whole one, and government to tech sector could be a whole conversation. I will say that, in a sense, the government structure and movement is much more rigid. It's much slower and heavier. And if I needed an analogy, I'd use one from, say, a maritime and boats and things like that, where when you're in a startup, and it doesn't matter if you're 10 people or 50 people or 100 people, and those are the people you care about. You want to deliver business results. You want to provide for the families. You want to grow. You want to grow the revenue and the impact. You can make very big decisions quickly because it doesn't affect more than that amount of people. If you're a larger corporation, you have hundreds of paying clients, and you have to consider them too. But at the end of the day, it's still a decision you can make relatively quickly. In government, when decisions impact everyone, and I've worked as an advisor for the Minister of Education, for the Minister of Tourism, for the Minister of Diaspora Affairs. In every field, when you make decisions, A, the budgets are much bigger, and B, what's at stake is much larger. Because if you're making a decision, say in the Ministry of Education for changing curriculums, you're not impacting a few dozen or hundred of people who work around you, and you're not even impacting a few thousand people from the adjacent companies who you're in contracts with. You're impacting the lives of 2 million Israeli kids in the school system, and you're impacting the future of Israel and where it's going to go. And so in that sense, a lot of things are done with a lot more caution and also with a lot more time. And it takes time to steer, not a little sail ship or speedboat, but to steer like a big aircraft carrier, which is what the ministries are. I will say that within that framework, I've seen some politicians who are, let's say, more risk avert, and some people who are happier to take challenges and try and figure out creative ways. As an example, the Ministry of Health, which you can imagine is a very highly regulated field, they have what they call sandboxes, where they let entrepreneurs partner with the ministry to think outside the box about ways to tackle issues on the table, understanding that you need to move at that speed between high tech and innovation, and it needs to meet the government someplace, but also that you can't just let it run wild. And I think that's an interesting example of interaction between the Israeli tech industry and Israeli sort of legislative regulatory officials. One thing you asked about is the sort of openness and accessibility of the management and people in politics. And I've seen different ones. I know Lightrix from within, and I can say the management is, in my opinion, very accessible. I'm sure there are other companies where it's not quite like that. And the same is true in politics. I've seen members of Knesset and ministers who give their personal phone number out to the public, and they want to hear from the public. Remember, at the end of the day, these are public servants. They represent a constituent of some sort, and they want that direct connection. And I've seen others who are a bit, let's say, overwhelmed by receiving sometimes thousands of WhatsApps or messages from people they've never met with a date to their personal number. So it really, really does vary.
So I guess on more of a personal note, you transitioned from government to high tech. You know, people speak of pivoting to high tech. What was that transition like? How did you find maybe a change in culture?
So the first thing, I had to get a whole new wardrobe, because when I was in the Knesset and in government ministries, there's a dress code, and it's not just about long trousers, it's also button-down shirts and things like that. And if you go to a group of engineers in the Israeli tech scene coming in with long trousers and a button-down shirt, you're not going to get very far. But besides little anecdotes like that, there's definitely a transition. I think there's a transition in a mindset, like I said. There's a transition in the sort of sway and impact of what you do. And I remember my grandmother, when I told her I was transitioning, she was very happy for the new job. But she also asked me, what's she going to do now that she doesn't see in the newspaper the things I'm working on? Because there's a sort of that feeling that you're going to do something a bit different and not necessarily the biggest things of the day. At the same time, and I've written about this a little bit in the past, there are a lot of things I think that the government can and maybe should learn from the private sector. I'll give one very clear example, but setting clear KPIs and measurable goals and being able to say, yes, we achieved this, or no, we didn't, and this is where we need to improve and why. There are certain places, obviously, that do it slightly better than others. There are other places where it's very lacking. I think there are very few politicians who are willing to say, within 2 years, this is the measurable goal we aim to achieve, and also set something which is meaningful and not just one where they know they're going to achieve it anyways and there's no real effort put into changing the course of anything. I think those are definitely big things that can go down. And the second one has to do, and here it's actually a bit of a paradox, with long-term planning. And I say it's a paradox because some of the longest planning done is, by definition, the government ministries. When you're, for instance, laying down train tracks or the metro project in Tel Aviv, those are projects where you start working on and you know they're only going to come to fruition 15 or 17 or 20 years down the road. So it's extremely long-term plan. On the other hand, when you move away from heavy infrastructure, because of the political discourse, a lot of politicians like to have gains that they can show. And if they know that there's going to be an election in a year or 2 or 3, that's the timeline. The timeline is to be able to complete something successfully, obviously, and be able to parade it and showcase it come the next primary election or the next general election. And in that sense, a lot of things which personally I think need to happen in this country and should happen in this country don't, because of that political constraint, because ministers would rather invest their resources, their time, and our taxpayers' money in things that can give them immediate gains as opposed to long-term planning, which might help.
That I've been curious about for a while is, in the various government ministries, there's the Minister of Health, and then there's the Director General of the ministry. Can the Director General do some of these things, like without the political, like, do they have their own goals, or it's also guided by?
So let's remember 2 things. First of all, the Director General is appointed by the minister. And his role is actually a very simple one. He's the liaison, if you would, and the manager who is between the political elected representative and the professionals. And it's important to say, we have a lot of very good public servants in Israel, whether it's the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Transportation, or any other ministry you can imagine, who are professional at what they do. And they do their job very well. And the job of the Director General is to take the vision or the directive, of the minister and see, how do we translate that into operative plans which align with what the ministry is supposed to be doing. Just to give a very flat out example, the Ministry of Culture is not going to go and purchase weapons for the IDF. It has nothing to do with the ministry. How do we align that vision with what the ministry is doing? So if a minister, for instance, comes in and says, listen, my big vision in the Ministry of Tourism is to double the number of foreign tourists in Israel. Okay, so now you have to start building plans. The two biggest blockers for tourism into Israel are, surprisingly, one is flights, capacity. There's only X people who can come within a certain time frame. And if you don't have more flights, then you don't have more tourists. And Ben Gurion Airport, as everyone knows, obviously not now during the war, but in general, is more or less at full capacity when it comes to flights per minute or per hour and all those indexes to how many planes can land. So if you don't open another international airport, which is being done slowly, so Haifa now has a few short distance international flights, Ramon, which is by Eilat, has short distance international flights. If you don't think about how to increase the capacity of flights, you're not going to have more tourists. And the second one isn't flights, but accommodation. Tourists who come near need a place to sleep. And if you have X hotels rooms, then that determines how many people can sleep. And X Airbnb apartments, that determines how many tourists you have. And so if you're using that example, if that's the vision of the minister is to have double the amount of tourists within 10 years, then essentially we have to double the capacity of flights and of hotels within 10 years. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. I think in that sense, things can be done. And they not necessarily have to be very political in the bad sense of the way, because you can also have, using the same example, the directive of the minister might not be, I want to double the amount of tourists. It might be, you know what, we have peace agreements with Egypt. Let's focus on Egypt and Jordan. And now we have the Abraham Accords in the Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain. And let's see how we triple the number of tourists from Muslim Arabic-speaking countries. And that's a very different aspiration on the minister's side, which translates into different plans on the director general and in the professional side of things. So I don't think that when I say political things, they have to be ones that necessarily need the director general to step in and do things that aren't what the minister wants. I just like to hope that the minister and the political people who are elected and take office understand that their role isn't only to be reelected and bring short-term gains, but to do things that sometimes take a little bit of...
Are those goals taken seriously by the staff and then also by the constituents? Is the reaction to doubling tourism, is that, wow, what a great goal. We can definitely accomplish that with the right cooperation? Or is it like, okay, there's an election coming up and this isn't going to happen?
I think it depends on the goal. We were talking about a very specific example, but if we go to a different ministry and we talk about the Ministry of Agriculture as an example, there are some people and some constituents and some people who have the right to vote in the next elections who view it as a big blocker when it comes to reducing the cost of living in Israel, because a lot of the regulation around import and export of food runs through that ministry. And so just as an example, it's not a secret, honey in Israel costs about 3 times as much as it does in Europe. And one of the ways to reduce the cost of honey is by reducing all sorts of tariffs and taxes on import of honey. And there's a problem because other people view the Ministry of Agriculture as the group that's there to defend them. And I'm talking about, of course, the people who produce eggs and milk and honey here in Israel. And so when you talk about what the minister does, part of the question is who are his constituents and what is the value set that he brings from home. And I have my value set, and I think it's perfectly legitimate that different politicians share that and other politicians don't. That's part of being part of the democracy. And what course of action do they take that they think is going to please their constituents? One of the politicians I worked with once said to me that the best thing for a politician is when you do what's right, but also brings votes to the table. The worst thing for a politician is when you do something that you know is wrong, morally, whatever it is, and it also drives voters away. And then there are 2 options in between. You can do what you know is right, but you're going to lose voters for it. For instance, unpopular fights or battles around certain topics. Or you can do what you think brings voters, but isn't necessarily the right thing to do. And in that sort of a matrix of 4 options, there are probably a lot of politicians in Israel, and this is my subjective opinion, who are more concerned with what brings voters than they are with what's right.
In high tech, not that ethics and moral decisions can also take place, but Do you ever see that same calculus with, the CEO or with the higher decision makers?
Look, I think obviously there are moral questions in business, and it depends on what business you're dealing with too. So if you're dealing in terms that have to, in fields, let's say like medicine and things like that, then your ethical questions are probably a lot greater than they are if you're dealing in a different field that has less of a sort of feeling of that sense. That said, the goal, I think, is very clear in business, which is to maximize the shareholders' revenue and profits. And that's what you're supposed to do. Now, obviously, there are also regulatory constraints when it comes to certain things you can't steal, whether even if it increases what you have in your pocket, right? That's not part of the options. And then there are other sort of ethics. And I think ethics here might be a narrow discussion, but it's a balance. It's a delicate balance between what you do that helps employees and what do you do with investing in business. So if you take a very silly almost example from like a day-to-day operation of a company, how much do you take from your company's budget to invest in welfare, in fun days, in parties, in food in the offices, as opposed to taking that same dollar and investing it in another marketing activity? Or now I could take that discussion and frame it in a very different way, which is how much do I invest in making sure I retain my top talent and have the best people in marketing and in tech and everything else? And it's the same question, which is a very different mindset. So here I think the question of ethics and what you do and how you drive decisions it's a little bit more straightforward in a sense, but obviously there's dilemmas in every place.
With deciding on making fun days and parties and things, I've heard from a lot of people who work in high tech that it's nice, not that Lightrix does this, but other companies, like it would be nice to go to like Rhodes in Greece for 3 days, but sometimes people just want to be paid more. Or it's nice to have C-Bus or get free delivery for lunch, but it would just be nice to be paid. What's your sense of having ice cream in the office or like those perks? What's your sense?
Yeah, so as in Israel, there's a whole social and online industry that talks about these topics. And if you have 21 or 24 flavors of ice cream, it's a big decision making and decision maker influencer in where you're going to go work. Look, I think, speaking again from my perspective, I think it does reflect a lot of what we do as management think at Lightrix. We're not a social welfare office. And people come and they get paid nicely and they're rewarded for, like I said at the beginning of our talk, hard work and good people, and they bring good results to the business. And yes, they need to be rewarded and recognized for that. At the same time, doing everything through a salary isn't necessarily the best route to go, because you want people to come out of their cubicle or office or whatever place they're opening. We have a special setup in Lightrix. We call it clusters. It's not an open space. It's not cubicles, but different topic. But you want people to interact with their colleagues, and you want them to do it over a cup of coffee. And maybe you want them to sit down and have lunch with each other. And it's a business decision. It's not just a question of perks. You mentioned companies that take employees away for 3 days, getaways in another country. We don't do that. We don't think that we do that. And if there are other companies who think that it gives them a lot of value, kol hakavod, and that's their decision to make. I do think at the same time that there's also a benchmark and baseline expectation within certain industries. And if you want to be competing for the top talent and for the best people, then you have to be in that set. And in that sense, Lightrix, even though we're in Jerusalem, and we could talk about this a little bit if you'd want, Jerusalem has a bit of a different ecosystem than a lot of Israelis imagine when it comes to high tech. But we're as competitive as any other employee in that scene, right? So if we're competing with companies who are in Tel Aviv or Herzliya for their designers and their engineers and their marketing people, then yes, if that's what they get at a certain office, we have to make sure that we at least match that. Even some things I think we do better than others, but the bare minimum is to be part of the game and be within that benchmark.
That's really interesting to hear from your part of the decision making, to hear that there is wisdom behind these perks, because you do hear there are Facebook groups where people make jokes and complain, but that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned Jerusalem and the Jerusalem tech ecosystem. Go to Tel Aviv and Google and Meta, Monday.com, they're there, and that's maybe part of the Tel Aviv ecosystem. But why is Lightrix here, and what's growing here?
So before I zoom into Lightrix, I do want to say that Jerusalem has an ecosystem, and it might not be as big and robust as Tel Aviv, but we do have a lot of things here. From different investment groups. So just to mention, our crowd sits in Jerusalem, and JVP now sits in other places too, but started in Jerusalem and sits here. Pico Partners have There's all sorts of different investing at different levels that have presence in Jerusalem. And also on the company, there are lots of startups, but there are also more mature companies. So Lightrix is one, which we're talking about at length here today. Mobileye is a huge employee also in Jerusalem. Fullpath, another tech company with hundreds of employees globally, but based in Jerusalem. So I think there is an ecosystem here, and there are groups. We sit next to Hebrew University's Givat Ram campus, and Apple have offices there. So yes, it's not as big as other R&D centers they have in Israel, but it exists, and people tend to overlook that. And when you zoom into Lightrix and we ask, why are we here today in Jerusalem? What's the values? I think there's really two things. One is, like I mentioned at the beginning, the founders, started at Hebrew U. They were living in Jerusalem when it started, and that's where the company started, right? So it started, it grew, it expanded, it grew, it expanded, it became what it is. It became an established company. And I think at some point you need a very good reason to move elsewhere. We do have offices in other places. I mentioned the UK and the US where we have offices. We also have an R&D center in Haifa in northern Israel. But those decisions of expansion, they come from really, even like the perks I mentioned before. Yes, there's a thought process behind and what you want to achieve with each step. And when we look at Jerusalem from our perspective, then there are a few big things that keep us here. One is there's a giant talent pool. Jerusalem is Israel's largest city by far. About 1 million people in Jerusalem today. It's twice as much as Tel Aviv. Even when you just go down to numbers, there's a lot of people here. And if you go to the Jerusalem metropolitan and you include things like Ma'ale Adumim and Mevaseret and Gush Etzion, they're here. And if you look at places like Modi'in, which are in between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, then people there have to choose which train to get on. But essentially, it's the same distance to commute every morning. And we think that there's a big pool of talent here. The second thing we look at, and Lightrix as an organization has proven it, I think, in a very big way. Jerusalem has some of the best academic programs in Israel. And we sit very close to Hebrew University with Hebrew University's computer science department. Hundreds of students each year graduate. Some of them are really the best talent Israel has in the field. And when you sit close to them, then you can recruit juniors. You can take people to student positions while they're at school, and they can literally walk down the campus and come work for you for a day or two during the year. And if they're very good, then we'll offer them a contract to continue. And the same with Jerusalem and computer science. It's also true with applied math departments or things like that where we need people. And it's not just true in computer sciences. It's also true for Bezalel, which is one of the top design schools. And as a company that deals a lot with visual creation and visual creativity, having top UI, UX designers and people who understand the nuances of things that are really visually aesthetic or not aesthetic and how to approach those topics, it's a huge asset. So that's another reason which we really enjoy Jerusalem. And I think the third one, and this maybe come visit our offices to see, but it doesn't feel like Tel Aviv. And this isn't a bad thing about Tel Aviv. It's just we have our own sort of vibe to the place. It's different. It's a different pace of life. It's a different way of working. And we like it very much. We just moved into new offices. I think our gardens are the best gardens you'll find in any office, definitely in Jerusalem, but maybe beyond. And there's no reason to not have an ecosystem in Israel's largest metropolitan. Just need more people to buy into it. It's not just high tech. At the end of the day, Tel Aviv is Israel's business center. It's not just about the tech scene. Also the big law firms and accounting firms, and they're mostly Tel Aviv based. Now, some of them have offices in Jerusalem, some don't. Some have different setups. There are other offices in Jerusalem. So obviously when the pull of Israel's economic play is in Tel Aviv, then the high tech is also in Tel Aviv. But it's not only there. And I mentioned Haifa before in passing, but where our offices are in Haifa, the R&D, Intel are there, and IBM is there, and Meta is there, and Google is there, and Microsoft. Everyone's also in Haifa. By the way, for a similar reason to what I just said now, all those companies want to sit close to Technion, and they want to tap into some of Israel's best talent. And Haifa is a gateway to the north. There are great people, great engineers and designers and product people all over Israel, not just in the Gush Dan area. So sometimes you just have to think a little bit outside the box and say, okay, I'm willing to hire from here, not from here, and that's fine.
That's pretty eye-opening because I think a lot of people just naturally tie Tel Aviv to high tech and to startups. So to hear that there is such an ecosystem might not be such common knowledge. I think we can segue a little from the top human talent to maybe the AI world and how now that Lightrix is AI driven, what's the company's relationship with AI? Did it feel oh, everyone else is doing AI, we need to include it? Or what was that decision like, or bringing AI in?
AI has definitely been the buzzword for the past few years. But AI as a concept isn't new. It just used to be called ML or machine learning. Now, obviously, there are differences and technology has evolved and it's not quite one on one what was done. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it. But in a sense, yes, we've been doing machine learning and algorithmic learning and all sorts of things like that a lot before it was a buzzword. What really changed in the past few years, and you can put your finger on it, it's the summer of 22 as a breaking point. But if for those who remember, the listeners, around April, if I remember correctly, of 22, OpenAI released DALL-E 2, which was the first text to photo, text to image creation. You could type in something, and then there was like this trend of lots of avocado chairs going around and things like that. But as a company that deals with creative and visual creatives, videos and images and editing, we understood that something's different because you can now edit via text. And this obviously is part of a bigger revolution that's happening around us, which has to do with LLMs, large language models, and interaction in general between humans and computers. My grandfather, who was born in Toronto, his brother taught computer science at the University of Toronto for many years. He was at the faculty there. And in the 1950s, he was part of the team that built the first computer for the university. But that computer wasn't sitting on a desktop or in a briefcase. That computer was basically a building. And to interact with that computer and other computers, you needed punch cards and you needed electrical engineers who were rerouting wires literally in order for us to be able to communicate with computers. And if you fast forward, then there are all sorts of things along the way. IBM's mainframe computers and things are getting a bit smaller. And then Macintosh and graphic interaction and being able to click on an icon and not just type in code and things like that. And the past few years, we're seeing that people, whether it's OpenAI's ChatGPT or using Anthropic's Claude or Cursor and all these things, you can write in English and get lines of code, meaning you can talk to the computer in human language as opposed to in computing languages. And that is a huge revolution. And for Lightrix, when we saw the revolution, it was a very quick understanding that paradigms are shifting, that what we used to do is changing. And we have to be part of that change because it's people today who want to write books aren't going to use typewriters. It just doesn't work in today's world. And in that sense, it was a very interesting, quick process, I think, relatively quick process of adopting AI across the board. Also in product, meaning using AI to build features and give value to our users, which we just couldn't have done before because it was things that would cost too much, or the process would be too long or were unimaginable. And also in the day-to-day work process of how we do things at Lightrix, because you can, just as an example, I don't know if you've seen it or not, Google are now integrating Gemini, which is their LLM, their model, inside Gmail. So at the top of an email thread, you have a summary. It just pops up automatically of what's been said so far. So instead of reading dozens of emails that you might have missed because you are on vacation, you actually see it in 5 or 6 bullet points. And there are lots of other examples like that. And as an organization, we had to adapt quickly. I'll give one example, which I think is a good one. In many of our interviewing and hiring processes, we started to switch the home assignments to ones where you're expected to use AI. And hiring managers began asking candidates in the interview, what AI tool did you use to help you complete your assignment? And if a candidate, I'll take one extreme, right? If there are candidates who are afraid of admitting that they're using AI, that's not necessarily the type of people we want in the organization these days. On the other hand, when you ask that question, then it opens a whole discussion. How you use AI, what tasks do you do where it can help you as a sparring partner? Where can it help you improve your productivity? Where do you think that you still do a better job than AI? And we're talking about human creativity, then yes, creativity is a great example of a place where AI can become a powerful tool, but it's not going to replace necessarily the human mind and thinking about those out-of-the-box ideas. All of those things really helped us drive that AI adoption across the organization.
It's a fascinating journey with AI that we're maybe in the very early stages of. So to hear that things are already so much in the works and there's a lot to come.
I think it's interesting as a global journey. We're at the early stages of it, and no one really knows what's going to be in 2 years or 3 years. But I use that date before of 22 because we're in the summer of 25. It's only been 3 years, right? 3 years ago, none of us were talking about ChatGPT, and 6 weeks ago, my daughter, who's going into third grade now, 8 years old, came home from school and told me that in computer class, they're learning how to communicate with ChatGPT and how to use it as a tool. And that's the future. And we talked about education, decisions in the education system, and things that need to happen. Yes, it's a very fast and rapidly changing environment, but it's the future of how people are going to be doing things. And we all have to buy into it at some level or another, in my opinion.
Buffeting around. And it doesn't have to be so lightning. You can elaborate on. Aaron, what's your favorite Jerusalem restaurant?
That's a really tough question. A lot of my childhood restaurants have closed, but I will say that instead of choosing a restaurant, I'm going to choose a place and anything in Machne Yehuda. Just walk around Machne Yehuda, especially if it's busy, and hearing the noises, smelling the smells.
I couldn't agree more. It's also my happy place on a Friday morning. Yeah, wow. It's so fun to go to the Shuk. A startup or a high-tech company that you admire outside of Lightrix?
Look, I think there's so many examples of that. Wow. We've been talking about AI, so let's go there. Think about what OpenAI have done in 3 years. They've changed our world. Putting tech aside, they've changed the discourse, the public discourse. And I think even if I don't like every single step they've taken along the way, they've done a very good job advancing their mission in a very short period of time.
And like you said, it's only the beginning. So an exciting world ahead. And finally, singer. Favorite Israeli singer or band?
So Israeli singer is Ehud Banai. Down. That's the easiest question of the lightning round. If I need, whether it's a happy place or an escapism place, just Spotify, Ehud Banai, close my eyes and I'm good.
That's awesome. The Banai family, a storied family in Israel. Random fun fact. So where we lived in Tel Aviv, the landlords of that apartment sold the apartment and it went to their kids. And one of their kids was the manager of Ehud Banai. So I started listening to it after. Is, right? Yeah, exactly. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on Sababoosh. It's been really a delight.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining us on Sababoosh for this eye-opening conversation with Aaron Kalman about the world of Israeli high-tech. In next week's episode of Sababoosh, I'll sit down with Jonathan El-Khoury, a Lebanese Christian and outspoken advocate who grew up as part of a minority within a minority in Israel. From questions of identity and belonging to navigating politics, society, and representation, Jonathan shares his unique journey and bold perspective on what it really means to be Israeli. This conversation challenges assumptions and opens a window into a side of Israel many people don't often hear about. Stay connected with us on social media. Be sure to follow Sababoosh on your podcast listening platform to get the latest episodes. And don't forget to visit our website, sababoosh.com, and subscribe to the Substack, where we publish articles on all aspects of Israeli culture. There are currently more than 50 articles ranging from Eurovision to the slang term Sachi. I'd also like to ask you to follow and rate Sababoosh on your podcast platform of choice, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or another. Ratings really help us extend our reach. Thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope that you'll continue. We have some really exciting guests lined up. In fact, we have lined up weekly episodes for the next 5 weeks, so look forward to more frequent episodes. We'd love to hear from you. Reach out with comments and ideas to jake@sababoosh.com. Who would you like to see as a guest?